Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Matthew Eisen, and I'm very honored and thankful that you're attending this session, whether you are attending in person or just attending virtually. This session is entitled Community Colleges and Dual Enrollment, Moving from Credits to Credentials. And so my hope today for us is that we better understand the relationship between dual enrollment and community colleges and how that relationship has developed historically and how it might be challenged by current iterations of policy and current trends in higher education policy that extends beyond dual enrollment and dual enrollment opportunities. So thank you so much for attending. Just a little bit of bio information. As I mentioned, my name is Matthew Eisen. I am about to graduate with my PhD in Higher Education Administration from Ohio University. That should be fully completed by December of 2021. Very excited to be finished. I am currently the Assistant Director of the College Credit Plus program at Sinclair Community College. Sinclair is located in Dayton, Ohio, and serves over 17,000 students, unique students annually. And College Credit Plus is Ohio's dual enrollment program, which has been in existence now. This is its 7th year. And the College Credit Plus program statewide serves about 75,000 students annually. Sinclair enrolls more than 8,000 different high school students for credit through an academic year at this point. So it's a very large program, both in the state as a statewide policy framework, and Sinclair's dual enrollment program through College Credit Plus is also very robust. I myself have more than 10 years of higher education and student affairs experience, working predominantly at community colleges, but I also have a desire to conduct original research and to think about how institutional, state, federal policy really influences students and practitioners at the ground level. I do a lot of work on education and finance, as I mentioned, community colleges, dual enrollment, research utilization in policy implementation. So this is just a little bit of my research background and what I'm trying to do when I think through issues and conduct research relevant to the position that I hold in the work that I do. So I'm really excited to be able to be with you here today and to present a little bit. But before we begin the formal presentation, I do want to take a moment and recognize that my home, which is in Springfield, Ohio, as well as the institutions that I'm affiliated with, Sinclair Community College is my employer, and Ohio University as the institution I'm currently enrolled in, all three of these places sit on the historical lands that belonged to the Shawnee in Miami or Miami indigenous populations. And like most indigenous populations, their land was taken from them, either through coercive administrative action, as in unfair treaties and things of the sort, and as well as just through violence and brute force. So, as part of my journey into understanding social injustices and being committed to a more equitable educational future, I just wanted to take a moment and acknowledge that my home, as well as my institutions, sit on this land, that we are guests by our own invitation and not necessarily the invitation of the people that came before us, and want to acknowledge that history. So thank you very much. So just moving into the agenda for our presentation today, I want to give you a little contextual history of dual enrollment and community colleges specifically. There's a very unique relationship there, and I think it's really important to contextualize that relationship to understand some of the research that I want to cite and talk about. But I also want to provide a little bit of an understanding of performance-based funding, or PBF 2.0, and I'll explain the 2.0 in greater detail once we get there. But it's really important to also understand performance-based funding as a policy, a large-scale higher education policy initiatives that has grown parallel to the growth of dual enrollment in this country. I also then want to move into research on dual enrollment and credential attainment. If you remember, the title of this presentation was Moving from Mere Credits to Credentials Within the Community College Context. So I want to talk about research on dual enrollment and credential attainment And then I also want to, I'm going to highlight some previous research, but then mostly I'm going to highlight the research that I have done and share some of that with you. And then I want to move into a discussion of just the future implications and what does this mean for dual enrollment policies in the various state contexts that we find ourselves in. What does it mean for the community colleges and their relationships to dual enrollment students and programs. In the in-person session, this part of the presentation would be much more interactive, but in a digital space, it's hard to have that sort of engagement, particularly in a pre-recorded video. And so I hope that when we get to that stage in the presentation, you'll be able to just kind of listen to some of the ideas and hopefully perhaps maybe take them back into your own offices, your own communities at which you work. Perhaps it's in a classroom if you're a student, or in a professional environment, and kind of digest the information and think through if some of the issues that I'm presenting here today are going to be relevant for your particular contexts. And hopefully to kind of chew on that, digest that, and see what kind of implications and what kind of options for practice may exist. So again, I just want to start with a larger history of kind of dual enrollment and community colleges. So just broadly at this point, more than 25% of high school students take dual enrollment courses in the country. That was a number from 2012. That was up from 4%, about 10 years before that. It's most likely larger than 25% now. It's really hard to get an accurate count because states measure their higher education and subsequently their dual enrollment populations in very different ways. But at least 1 out of 4 high school students are enrolled in taking dual enrollment courses throughout the country. And about 75% of all of that credit is awarded at a community college. Now that means at least 25% is awarded at a 4-year institution. And so 4-year institutions, of course, are a very important part of the dual enrollment ecosystem. But overall, community colleges are awarding about 3/4 of all dual credit in the nation. Part of that is just the history of how dual enrollment evolved. Before there were large-scale policy implementations, usually at the state level, dual enrollment typically began as just bilateral agreements between a local high school and a local community college, a college that was embedded within those similar communities where they recognized the need to provide high-achieving students better academic opportunities. And the community college and the high school would make an agreement that would allow those high-achieving students to take college courses. So from those bilateral agreements and arrangements, we've morphed into much more state policy, state constructed programs that set certain rules on how the courses will be funded, who will be paying for the courses, who is responsible for administering the credit and doing quality control checks and things of that nature. From the community college perspective, the growth of dual enrollment has had a sizable effect on the overall enrollment picture at community colleges. So approximately 10 to 15% of all community college students in the nation today are dual enrollment students. And it's a little hard sometimes to pin down the exact percentage. This is typically reported as students that are younger, that are 18 years or younger. As the kind of the cutoff, because it's sometimes hard to find them by student status, but rather by age, which means there are some students who graduated high school at 17 that are enrolled as traditional students that are certainly counted in that percentage. But overall, that's probably a very small amount of students. That it's 10 to 15% of all community college students, and that's going to vary depending by the state. There are going to be states with smaller percentages than that, and then states with much higher percentages of that. And as you can see, from the spring of 2019 to about 2020, to about the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, dual enrollment within the community college sector grew by like 8.7%. Like most areas of community college enrollment, in the last 18 months, we've seen a decline, and dual enrollment did slightly decline, although much smaller than other enrollment sectors within community colleges. But dual enrollment overall has been growing steadily within the community college sector. And virtually every single community college in the nation today is offering a dual credit option. And so from the community college perspective, it's become a major source of enrollment, which is a major source of funding, as most public institutions get some funding from state appropriations, as in addition to the tuition revenue that they derive from students. So community colleges in particular are the sector of American higher education that stands to either benefit or be harmed by dual enrollment policy implementation. They are going to be the sectors of American higher education that are going to be most responsible for discharging the curriculum. So how larger higher education policy within a state context is set, what type of students, who's going to gain access to these programs, and what those sectors are going to be the sectors that are impacted the most. So I want to take just a few minutes and talk a little bit about performance-based funding 2.0. And so it's called PBF 2.0 by the scholars who study it because I believe it was in the 1970s, there was an early iteration of performance-based funding. And by performance-based funding, what most scholars and policymakers mean is they no longer want to award subsidy to their public institutions of higher education by mere enrollment, by merely counting the number of students that the college has at a certain census state. In the state of Ohio, that was historically like 14 days into the term. 14 days into the term, take account of the students that are still enrolled, and based on that number, the state was going to allocate you a certain level of appropriation. Kind of growing out of the completion agenda and calls for greater accountability within post-secondary policy and education finance, states began to move that funding away from enrollment and to attach it to certain completion milestones. Most of those common metrics are things like retention, like term to term or year to year retention, graduation rates, how many credentials are you graduating with, transfer rates, recognizing that community college students are not always interested in pursuing a community college credential, measuring the transfer rates and how many of their students move on to four-year institutions. And different states have all sorts of different frameworks for this. There are states where 100% of their funding, like Ohio, like my state, are performance-based funding, while other states it's just a smaller percentage, and they still are awarding most of their state appropriations by enrollment. But this is becoming a more common form of higher education finance at the state level. 41 states have performance-based funding policies, whether they are funding all of their higher education through PBF policies, whether it's adding bonuses if you hit certain sorts of milestones, they want to reward those institutions and providing them extra subsidy. So that's kind of the background in performance-based funding in terms of the policy. Now, some of the research on it, that last bullet point, just to talk a little bit about that, is that as a state implements performance-based funding, what we're seeing is that maybe 5 to 7 years after that, you see a redistribution away from the number of students who get associate's degrees at community colleges and an increase in the number of students getting short-term credentials. But that the overall completion percentages are not changing. We're not seeing more students graduating overall with performance-based funding. It's just really a redistribution away from associate's degrees to community college, or to short-term credentials. And if we think critically about that for a moment, why that might be the case, is as a community college, as an institution, as the leaders of that institution who are fiduciary responsible for that institution, recognizing that the completion milestones that come from short-term credentials are going to come quicker than an associate's degree. And so redesigning academic pathways, redesigning services, creating both the formal and informal structures within the organization to have students complete those types of credentials is going to be beneficial to the institution because they're going to be able to collect that state subsidy faster. There are less departure points for the student. Community college historically enroll students that are working relative to peers at four-year institutions, family obligations, traditionally underserved populations relative to other sectors of American higher education. So there's a lot of incentives under a performance-based funding structure for community colleges to readjust themselves to kind of incentivize those short-term credentials. So I want that to be the context as we start thinking about dual enrollment and credential attainment a little bit. So I want to go through just a brief literature review on a couple of studies that really are looking at credential attainment for dual enrollment students. And these are studies that are really showing the positive effect, where dual enrollment students relative to their non-dual enrollment peers are matriculating to college after high school and getting a post-secondary credential at a greater rate. So ON's 2003 study, using the federal data set, found students were 8% more likely to earn any degree, controlling for a whole host of covariates, socioeconomic status being predominant there. We have another study looking at Illinois state data, where they were 7% more likely to earn a college degree. Speroni's 2011 really honed in on a specific variable, and that was completing college algebra as a dual enrollment student. So completing college algebra as a dual enrollment student for these Florida students was really associated with getting a bachelor's degree. And then the Strahl and Vargas 2014, some disaggregated completion percentages there, where Texas high school students, 47.2% of those students went on to get a post-secondary credential relative to their non-dual enrollment students at 30%. So again, some of these are more experimental designs, quasi-experimental designs, while others are just sort of reporting the percentages. But overall, just studies that are highlighting the positive effect of dual enrollment and trying to attribute as much causality to dual enrollment as they possibly can, which is limited in social science research from time to time. That these are some studies that are showing some positive effects on dual enrollment and post-secondary credential attainment. There are, however, a few studies that are showing a negative or null effect. So the first study from Washington State actually found students were less likely to graduate if they did dual enrollment than and less likely to matriculate to college after high school graduation. Now, the authors in that study really caution about interpreting that long term. There's some additional state policy things with community colleges within the state of Washington that they think might have really been at play there. So it's not really, the study's not suggesting that if you do dual enrollment, you're not going to matriculate to college. It's just there's some state policy context to interpret that a little bit. The Lawrence and King study is very, very interesting. I really want to point this out as a context for the rest of the conversation and presentation. This is a study that used a specific community college's institutional data and looked at their dual enrollment students, the students that took dual enrollment courses from them. And what they found is that those students were less likely to earn an associate's degree from that community college relative to a 4-year degree using National Student House Clearinghouse data. So as a community college, they were finding that their dual enrollment students do not return back to them to get a sub-baccalaureate credential from the community college. And again, the Speroni study I mentioned on the previous slide, really honing in on the benefits of college algebra as a class, found overall no necessary positive effect for students who took dual enrollment courses. So again, these studies are really suggesting overall, when you kind of survey the entire literature landscape, there's not like a negative effect. Students that do dual enrollment courses in high school don't overall get a post-secondary credential at a smaller rate or at a diminished odds relative to their peer students who didn't do dual enrollment. There is just a little bit of question, is there really a positive effect or is it really a null effect? And kind of what is the relationship there? And it's a little mixed. There are studies that show the positive effect, but then there are some studies that are showing, it really doesn't do anything when you can control for some other variables and other factors there. So now I just want to talk about my research a little bit here. I have an article. This research is going to be published at the Community College Review probably in January or sometime in the winter and the early part of next year. Because the research began basically asking this question: what is the relationship between community college or between dual enrollment and credential attainment? And really thinking about it in the community college context, in those credentials that historically are offered by community colleges, which are associate's degrees and below. There is a growing movement for community colleges to offer bachelor's degrees and 4-year degrees, but historically community colleges offer associate's degrees and below that. So I was really interested in thinking about credential attainment, not just overall, but really by credential type. So going back into the previous slides, the ON 2013 really disaggregated by credential type and found a positive effect for both bachelor's degree and associate's degree attainment. But most of the studies overall don't necessarily disaggregate by specific credential type. And so that was something that I was really interested in and wanted to explore in research. So I used a federal data set. There's the beginning post-secondary students. These are first-time, full-time students who entered a post-secondary institution for the first time in 2004, and then they were followed up again within 2007 and 2009, so 5 years after they started. I used a weighted sample of just over 16,000 students, and I conducted some binary regression along with completion percentage. It was binary in that the outcome variable of interest is just whether or not they graduated from a post-secondary institution, yes or no. And within that, within the regression analysis, I controlled for student demographics, socioeconomic status, high school performance, and college aspirations as they were reported in 2004 when they entered post-secondary education. And then I filtered the entire sample. I was interested, once I ran through this analysis once, the beginning post-secondary, the BPS 04 dataset includes all students who began in 2004, regardless of their age or when they graduated high school. And so I was really interested in if more recent dual enrollment policy changed those numbers in any way, as dual enrollment increased and more high school students had access to it. So I filtered the sample to include only 2003 and 2004 high school graduates, and then I ran the entire analysis a second time. And that was a weighted sample of 11,600 students. So that second filtering was 67% of the original sample, because as you would imagine, most of the students who begin college are graduating from high school, particularly if they're a first-time full-time cohort, which means they're enrolling for the first time at a full-time status. Most of those students in 2004 had graduated high school within the last year or two. But I did want to filter the remaining students out to look at the percentages and look at the regression model findings to see if there was any difference. So just going to go through a little bit of the percentages that I found. This is for the entire sample, and this is the completion percentages disaggregated by degree type. So we have the certificates in 2006, certificates in 2009, again, bachelor's degrees and associate's degrees, 2 years, 3 years after that. And what we see is that dual enrollment students are much more likely to get a bachelor's degree compared to their non-dual enrollment students, particularly 5 years out. But when you go through associate's degrees and certificates, you see that dual enrollment students are less likely to have those sub-baccalaureate credentials relative to non-dual enrollment students, or the entire student population looked at together. And a similar finding, when you just filter the data by high school graduates. Again, it looks like the computer is having a little bit of trouble loading all of that data up so quickly, so it's a little blurry as it unfolds here. But when you look at bachelor's degree attainment, 5 years out, you see dual enrollment students are much more likely to have that a bachelor's degree relative to their non-dual enrollment peers, but that it flips for certificates and associate's degrees. That non-dual enrollment students are more likely, they have at a higher percentage have those associate's degrees and certificates. So that's just kind of the base completion percentages. And rather, I didn't want to put in the entire table with the coefficients, but I did kind of copy over just the top line findings from the regression analysis for the entire sample. And so when you look at the entire table in the paper, you see a lot more of these coefficients, these numbers, because we're controlling for different types of covariates in the analysis. But the outcome variable of interest, looking at if you earned college courses, if you earned credit for college courses while in high school. When we just look at those students, yes, it's compared to those students who didn't take dual enrollment courses. They are more likely to get a credential, at any post-secondary credential, That parentheses is the odds ratio, where those students are more likely, when it's above 1, they are more likely to get that credential relative to their non-dual enrollment peers. But when you start to really disaggregate it by completion type, you see that dual enrollment students are much more likely to get a bachelor's degree than they are to get an associate's degree or certificate. And again, when you filter that by the 2003 and the 2004 high school graduates, you see very, very similar odds ratios there. You see overall dual enrollment students are more likely to have a post-secondary credential relative to non-dual enrollment students. But that all of that gains, most of those gains are found in bachelor's degree attainment as opposed to associate's or certificate degree attainment. So just thinking through that data a little bit and just asking ourselves, is that a problem? Well, I don't think it's a problem if our goal is helping students complete bachelor's degrees. There's absolutely nothing, that's fantastic. But thinking about the community college context that might not be offering bachelor's degrees, what does that mean for the community college? And it's a more complicated answer in that sense. It's a more complicated process. So a couple just selected findings here. The disparities in attainment by race and ethnicity. So when you really look through the rest of the research in the table, you see that Black and Hispanic students were more likely to obtain certificates relative to their white peers. So you don't necessarily see dual enrollment having a major change in equity in terms of the attainment rates between those. Aspirations were a strong determinant of attainment. So when you really look through the data and look at post-secondary aspirations, it's very intuitive to find that if you highest degree that you sought was a certificate, you were more likely to get a certificate. If your highest degree sought was a bachelor's degree or a doctorate degree or something, that was highly correlated with achieving that goal. So students that had lower post-secondary aspirations were, intuitively not likely to get a bachelor's degree. But that is an interesting finding when we think about dual enrollment's effect on post-secondary degree aspirations. And an interesting finding was just that socioeconomic status had no effect when you controlled for other variables in the study. So again, in the larger study, in the larger paper, you'd be able to explore this more on your own. I didn't want to just throw a bunch of numbers on the table, but I did want to show a little bit of that to you so you would have an idea of what's happening or going on in the study and some of the things that I'm talking about here in some of the findings. So, and I did want to highlight several of those findings so that you had a more robust understanding. So what are some things, what does this mean? It means that dual enrollment is in and of itself not equitable access. DE opportunities for students might not overcome the historical oppressive structures that really lower post-secondary degree aspirations and other barriers to enrollment. And that's an important thing for dual enrollment practitioners to just broadly consider, just independent of the community college context, because it suggests that simply providing students and traditionally underserved students the opportunity to earn college credit before in high school might not in and of itself change the post-secondary aspirations, which were highly correlated with the type of degree that you achieve. So that's important to think about. But specifically getting into the community college context, there seems to be this disjointed policy between access through dual enrollment programs, the desire to expand access to community college or to more students through community college dual enrollment programs, as well as completion. Within the performance-based funding structure, community colleges are really incentivized to enroll and prioritize the students that are going to complete the credentials that they offer. In fact, that's the only way they're going to be able to financially survive in the future. But what we see at the intersection of the growth of dual enrollment policy within states, as well as performance-based funding, is this disjointed mismatch. Because community colleges are being financially incentivized to design academic pathways around a certain group of students, sub-baccalaureate completers. But dual enrollment students, according to this study and some of the other literature, are really being shown to have bachelor's degree aspirations overall. And so community colleges are serving a group of students who might not be interested in getting a sub-baccalaureate credential. That mismatch is going to potentially create problems for the community college moving forward. And the question just really needs to be asked is, will community colleges continue to prioritize dual enrollment and dual enrollment opportunities? It is a very easy pathway to for enrollment and funding, but community colleges that are continually being asked to find students to completion, the implicit and explicit pressures that come from performance-based funding to design academic pathways around short-term credential options, it's going to make, there's just going to be some tension there. And we really do want to be mindful of that tension as policies continue to unfold over the next 3 to 5, 10 years. Community colleges are uniquely situated to serve local high schools and dual enrollment students, and while they want that enrollment, will it make financial sense for them to continue to go after a population that is kind of signaling that they have aspirations beyond the sub-baccalaureate credential? And so as a community college administrator, and as a dual enrollment administrator, and as somebody who thinks about community college and doing community college research a lot, I find this tension to be really interesting and just concerned about how it's going to play out moving forward. So just as we kind of end this conversation in this video here, there's a couple of ideas that I wanted to talk about in the setting with people who are doing this work and other practitioners, share some of the ideas of my local institution about some ideas like how can we alleviate this tension and this pressure between these maybe disjointed policies. And so one idea is doing specific CCP scholarships. That's what College Credit Plus scholarships or specific DE scholarships. Sinclair has a specific completion scholarship that we offer to students at certain high achieving academic thresholds. Now I will say the data on the history of our scholarships suggests it's not done, we don't get a lot of students from this. And we're internally looking at, do we need to lower the thresholds? Do we need to look at less credit hour thresholds, a lower GPA threshold? It's historically been a 3.0 GPA and completed up to 30 credit hours. But we have to acknowledge that maybe that's the wrong threshold, or we're targeting the wrong students with the scholarship. And those are some of the conversations that we're having internally as a way of trying to increase the post-matriculation yield of the students. Short-term credentials, right? Do we try to line up dual enrollment pathways with short-term credentials? But that really seems to be like not a great idea, at least from where I sit. There would be a mismatch, I think, between the students that are typically seeking dual enrollment opportunities and what's happening with those pathways. Another option is trying to complete more students before they graduate high school. Sinclair has done a great job of this. We have approximately 50 students a year now who graduate high school with an associate's degree, which is just an absolutely incredible accomplishment. It blows my mind every year when I see these students. As a community college graduate, it took me 3.5 years after I graduated high school, which I am very proud of as a first-generation college student. But it's truly inspiring to see these students 5.5 years ahead of the pathway completing these credentials. That is a way that you can line up the credential attainment goals under performance-based funding with dual enrollment. But we do have to ask how scalable that is. Are we really going to have that many students as part of dual enrollment programs that are going to be able to do that? And then a larger policy conversation going on in the nation today is free community college. If community college was just free overall to dual enrollment students and then to post-matriculated high school students, would you have just a greater influx of students coming to the community college, completing credentials before moving on to four-year schools? And that's an interesting conversation. I think free community college, whether or not it's going to happen, there's a large-scale proposal right now under the Biden administration that could really change dual enrollment funding and dual enrollment pipelines within various state contexts. But it's an interesting thing to think about is if that would be a sort of policy lever that would sort of bring these disjointed policies into better alignment. Really encouraging students to complete a community college credential before they move on to a four-year school, whether they're starting at 14, 15 as a dual enrollment student, whether they're starting at 18 as a graduated student. And one idea I didn't put on here is the proliferation of 4-year degrees at community colleges. That's another idea to be thinking about within specific state contexts and institutional contexts. Is there a desire to create more 4-year opportunities, particularly because dual enrollment represents the student population for a lot of community college who might be wanting those credentials, and if those credentials were in-house, would you have that better alignment? And I think that's an area of future research to see kind of where things go. So I just want to say thank you all very much for attending this session virtually. Again, my name is Matthew Eisen. Please feel free to reach out to me. Google Scholar if you're interested in the report when it comes out later, the research article in the Community College Review, and some other pieces I have on dual enrollment. You can find me on Twitter, Matthew Eisen 14. But email, if you just have any questions or comments about the presentation, about the research, please reach out to me. That's my email address at Ohio University. I would be happy to engage with you further, share some of the research, share some of the studies that I cited in this presentation, and would look forward to connecting you. So again, for all of you that couldn't attend in person, stay safe. I know for as many of you, I presented last year at NACEP and attended NACEP digitally. I know we're all really excited to get back to in-person. Doesn't look like it's happening as much this fall, but hopefully very soon we'll be together again. So again, thank you so much.